Hello everyone, my name is Ishan and today I'll be presenting on this topic called Flirting with Flutter at Getaround. For those who don't know Getaround, it's a scale up, not a startup anymore, and we're into car sharing. So peer-to-peer car sharing, like imagine Airbnb for cars. If you have a car, put it on a platform, rent it out by the hour, and then make money. A while ago, we wanted to try Flutter. And you guys must be wondering why is it called Flirting with Flutter. So when I proposed this talk to George, we still didn't know the relationship status, if you're going to be committed or not. So we were like, yeah, we're just flirting with Flutter. But by the end of the talk today, you will figure out where we are in terms of the relationship with Flutter at Getaround. I've been writing Android apps for about 6 years now. So come from native, tried Flutter. What I will talk about in this talk is why did we start looking into Flutter, our journey to find out whether or not it makes sense to use Flutter for the business and also for the technology, and if we should invest effort and time into that. What did we decide in the end, and how does the future look like for us, for the community, and Flutter itself? So the first point is why, or what's the motivation? That really came down from the upper management, and a few people were really excited to know about this thing, which was quite surprising because at the past companies, when we've introduced such technologies to the upper management, we've always faced friction. Here was the other side where the upper management said, we really like this technology, we would love the team to investigate and see if it can bring in value for the company. The reasons were simple. First was world-class user experience. So as you see on the Flutter website, on the Flutter showcase, and a lot of places, and also like Chris told us, Flutter can perform UI rendering at 60 FPS, and we wanted to give out a delightful app to our users. Flutter completely fit the bill, so we were like, why not? Flutter is also not React Native, so that was another plus point. Flutter code is compiled to the native ARM machine code, so it's much closer to the platform than how React Native does it, or any other cross-platform stuff. Xamarin does it. And UI rendering is expected to match native apps, so we're much closer to the platform. Maybe we're not there yet, but we've taken another step in that direction. The other one was world-class developer experience. So this was also a very crucial factor in deciding if we want to adopt this, because moving completely away from a stack that the developers and the community is comfortable with, about what we already have a lot of knowledge within the company and also outside, we also wanted to make sure that we don't hurt the developer experience, because it's the developers at the end of the day who are actually going to write things for your users and do things for the business. So it's not like we want to build something cool for the users, but we're going to give you very shitty tools to do the job. So we wanted to make sure we adhere to this thing as well. Flutter, as I think everybody knows here, allows hot restart, hot reload. So that was a really cool thing, especially because Google has been trying very hard with Instant Run. Didn't do anything. Now they're doing something with apply changes. Still not there yet. Expressive and flexible UIs that you can really write. Swift UI was out a bit later, and then also Jetpack Compose. But again, I think it'll take a while before people start actually using it. And majority of platform differences related to scrolling, navigation, and how you have some platform-specific widgets. Flutter already solved that for us, so we didn't have to do all that heavy lifting, which you would have to do if you were to use React Native, because you'll have to build all those bridges yourself if you don't find a third-party library. So scratching the surface initially, the whole timeline of this project looks like about 2 quarters, on and off with 6 developers, coming onto Flutter, doing something on the side, coming back again, and then so I've really tried to cram up a lot of information that we garnered or gathered over 6 months into like a 40-minute talk. So if there's anything that you'd like to know more, I'll be happy to answer at the end. What did we need, or what do we need, is the first question we asked the business if we were to make a switch to Flutter. So what are some crucial aspects that are really necessary for the app to function and the business to run smooth and also grow at the same pace? And those were the things that we identified in the current app. So things like basically for the architecture. If we are to move to a new technology, does it support any architecture patterns or whatever that the community is already familiar with, or do we really need to reinvent the wheel? Apart from that, what are the APIs that are available and what do we need? So like our app really relies heavily on maps. Our app relies on Bluetooth because we want to unlock cars using that. We also want to have quick access to the location services. Of course, we use the internet to make API calls. So do we have everything that we need available in Flutter without having to depend on third-party developers who are releasing 0.1.0 version of Flutter SDKs every single day? Or like, does the Flutter team has us covered? So we started doing some projects, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the next thing that we cared about was how is it going to look like if we were to develop? So what is the strategy going to look like? Because we have two separate repositories for the iOS and the Android source code. If we're saying that we want to share the source code, how are we going to do the Git merge? How are we going to share the code? How is the continuous integration going to look like? Or then how do we use Flutter? Because Flutter you can use in three ways. You either rewrite the whole app from scratch. You could also use platform views. And then there's also something called add to app. So what do we really need to do? And then the last part was, let's say everything goes perfectly fine. How do you advocate? Okay, maybe I'm the one who's excited about Flutter in my company. I can excite 2 more people because they've been actively working about that. But how do you convince, let's say, a team of 13 developers that, hey guys, stop writing native apps from tomorrow. You're going to be Flutter developers. It's not going to change. A lot of people might feel that, oh, if I put Flutter into my resume, tomorrow if I go out look for a job, they'll be like, you haven't been doing native development. We might not want to hire you. So those were the kind of things we also had in mind. How are we going to address that? So how to find answers to all of these things is what we did. And the simplest way, build a movie DB app. Anything you want to find out if it works or if you want to teach others, just build a movies DB app, and you can pretty much find out answers. You can say, oh, model view presenter pattern, this is how you implement, or MVVM, that's how you do. So yeah, just what I said. It's the best way to check if a technology works for you or not. So we built it, and this is how it looked like. Not on one device, on multiple devices, because we didn't just build it once. We built it multiple times. And you'll be like, why did you do that? Well, the simple reason was there were multiple developers who were trying out Flutter in parallel. So we decided, we're from different backgrounds, iOS, Android, how about we implement MVC in one of the apps, MVVM in another, and there was another developer who said, I'm going to try MVP. So which architecture are we going to adopt if we move to Flutter? But turned out none of that works really nice because stateless and stateful. So we had to move towards something like Redux or block pattern. Then there are other things like providers and a lot of things. Had to do a lot of comparisons there. What works, what doesn't. How big is a learning curve if we were to introduce that, because not everybody likes or everybody thinks in a functional way if you're coming from Java or let's say Kotlin backgrounds, also Swift, Objective-C. So that's why we built it multiple times. We had good results, nice learnings to share. And that was pretty easy, and I'd say it was love at first bite, right? So everyone that tried Flutter for the first time in the company actually loved it. There were people who were a bit averse to it because we have a developer who's been writing iOS apps for like 10 years. And to them, they're like, oh, okay, if Apple would have released Flutter, I might have tried it, but it's Google who's done it, so yeah, I'll hold it back. So, but For the Android folks, it was surprisingly even better because the way you declare UIs in Flutter is way better than you do in your XML layouts, right? So that's something, and I have a very hard time explaining it to managers or other iOS developers because iOS has a really nice UI API, right? So the way you define APIs there, it's amazing. The way you do animations, it's amazing. And it's very painful here. Maybe there are some expert UI developers, I'm not. So that's why I say that. Next, we wanted to push the boundaries because, okay, MovieDB's work, we made a network call, we showed a grid or recycler, whatever. But can we access location services from within Flutter? Or can we access Bluetooth? Can we use maps? This is what we wanted to try next. And we actually started implementing all of that in the MovieDB itself. So like I built a map feature where I actually started polling theaters nearby and showing where the movies are being played right now. So this helped us like integrate Google Maps SDK, which was doing something with the platform views. It was still experimental, but it worked for us. So we were like to the management, it works. Let's move on to the next thing. Someone else tried location services. It works. Next, let's move on to the next thing. Once that happened, then all the time while we were doing all this, we were actively documenting this. You may ask why? For this talk. So we knew eventually if we are going to go forward with it or not go forward with it, it would be amazing to share all these learnings with the community so that another company that wants to try this doesn't have to spend those 6 months and they can actually leverage what we learned and then think about whether or not they want to make that decision. So we've talked about the architecture that we needed, and we figured out there are multiple options there. So we have to pick one of those. The other thing was, how do we want to adopt it? So what's the development strategy exactly going to look like? So how to use Flutter? There are 3 ways, as far as I know. The first option, we start from scratch. We just kick off the whole current apps, and we rewrite everything in a Flutter app, initialized with Flutter build or Flutter module -- create, whatever that is. And then you have a fresh slate, no problem whatsoever. However, we were asked the question, how long will it take you to rewrite the whole app? And then came the answers, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, all in unison, right? And of course, this is how software development is. You can never predict these rewrites with great accuracy. And because there's varied level of experience, varied level of interests, everybody thinks in different directions. So it's better to stay away from those big rewrites. So this option was not going to work for us. The second was platform views. It was stable, I guess, back then. And yeah, it was stable, much stable than the next option that I'm going to talk about. And we actually started using platform views into the MovieDB app, and then we actually integrated a part of it into our existing app. So just for development purposes to see if it actually works. And this is how it looked like. So if you look at the very top, it is the Getaround logo because we're showing it in the navbar, and then we actually added a Flutter pop-up over a native, I think, iOS view controller. Then we also tried a bottom sheet over a native view. And then we also tried to add a single cell inside a native list view. Now all this worked. And I was pretty surprised that it worked. I wasn't expecting it to work, but it did work. However, as soon as we got to know that it works, we decided amongst the development side that we're not going to tell this to product managers. because if the product managers get to know there is a way to do a very small experiment and find out whether Flutter works or not, they will try to explore that option. And we did not want to. Primarily because we're unnecessarily coupling Flutter stuff into the main app, and we don't want to do that. Because if it fails, again, it'll be on us to remove it, and then another developer or a product manager might be like, hey, wait, can we do an iteration on that? So all the mess that we created, we will have to maintain, and we did not want to do that. So we also rejected that option. And last but not the least was add to app. Google wrote it is still experimental, not production ready. Me, all of my other colleagues, we read that. Our managers read that. But we were like, this looks like a promising option. Why is that? It's because the way you bring Flutter into your project as a separate Gradle module or a separate, I think, Xcode project in iOS. And we thought, if things go south, we can always just get rid of these modules and our current apps will keep on functioning. Another good thing about this approach was, if we were to integrate modules, like individual modules of Flutter into our projects, we could actually develop them in isolation. So you don't need to run your whole base app in order to test a small feature that you're building. You can just run your Flutter module in isolation, do all your hot reloads, hot restarts, whatever. When it's ready, just rerun it with the base APK or your Xcode project, and then it just works fine for you. And then this is the integration strategy we narrowed it down to. And I think probably when you all came in here, you might be wondering if we tried this or something else. We actually tried add to app. So Git happens, shit happens. And the thing was, what's our Git strategy going to be? So we have two separate repositories, but we're introducing a platform, cross-platform thing that allows us to share code. How do we share code? Again, 3 strategies. First one is subtrees. Second one is Git submodules. And the last one is Git monorepo. Everything comes with its own pros and cons. And again, we compared all of them. So how complex is it to do something with one or the other strategy? There are basically 4 or 5 operations that you have to use on a day-to-day basis. If you have new developers coming in, you have to clone the repository. Then you have to pull changes from the Flutter source code. You have to push changes to the Flutter source code. You have to pull changes from the native app, the main source code, and then you have to push changes to the native app. That's, I think, pretty much it. Yes, that we wanted to, that we wanted to use. With Git subtrees and Git submodules, there were some problems, not problems, but a bit of complexity that we would introduce in the Git workflow of the developers that are not writing Flutter, right? Because they have to make sure the Flutter source code is in sync always. We have to make sure the native one is in sync. Now, because we're working on the cool new shiny technology, we don't mind that effort. But do we really want our other counterparts who are not yet doing this to suffer that pain? Not really. Can we do something about it? You already know. Monorepo for the win. So we merged both the repositories, not painful at all, 2 Git subtree commands that just does a merge. And then we went off from there. And again, we were like, if things don't work out, we can just branch back and create our 2 separate repositories again. However, monorepo does not change the normal workflow. So you just clone the project. If you're an iOS developer, you do all your changes inside the iOS folder. If you're an Android developer, you do all your changes inside the Android folder. If you're doing something with Flutter, you do all your changes inside the Flutter folder, which actually helped us to overcome another problem that I'll discuss next. So all set. We figured out if Flutter works or not. It works. The architecture we can use, we probably nailed down, I think, on block pattern, along with some provider stuff. And the way we'll integrate Flutter, so add to app is what we're going to use. Version control workflow is also set. Is there anything that's remaining that you think is still missing?
Continuous integration on a monorepo.
Perfect. Continuous integration. So let's talk CI. Pretty important. You said it's hard. We also thought it was hard. It was not as hard. I'll tell you why. So the setup was pretty straightforward. The Android team was initially using TeamCity. The iOS guys were using CircleCI. So we were like, let's move to CircleCI because I didn't really like TeamCity. Circle was much closer to GitLab. You could have your YAMLs and you can configure all that. And then the question was, but what happens when you make a PR or you make a commit? Are you going to build everything? Of course not. At least for the native developers, if they're only making changes to the Android project, they don't want to know if the iOS tests are failing or not. It doesn't make sense. For the iOS developers, it's the same thing. However, if Flutter people are doing something, we want to make sure not only Flutter does not break, but the iOS and Android does not break. So we just wrote a simple shell script that would check all the commits in your PR, plus one more commit behind you from where you branched off. And if you made any changes in the iOS directory, you have to run the whole build. If you made any changes inside Android, you have to run the whole build. Flutter always runs. So CI for monorepo was not hard. Builds ran conditionally, like I said. The conditions I told you. It did bite us in the back lately, and I'll tell you why. But other than that, CI was not very problematic. So shipping an Easter egg, everything we figured out, we were able to continuously integrate and build the apps. Now it's time to ship and actually see if it survives in the hands of our customers, right? So if you do add to app, Google says it's experimental, but it's still working. And it's still working because Groupon said they were using it. I'm not sure if this has to be cut from the recording. Tencent for sure is advertised that they're using it. And a few other companies said that they were using it. It's working pretty well. So we were like, yeah, it should also work for us. So what we did was that we wrote a simple hello world screen. We added it to our debug builds. And then we built a small internal release that we shipped only to the company employees. We didn't tell them that it was there. And that's how it looked. So basically, this is a native nav drawer. I'm not sure what it's called on iOS, but it's like a nav drawer. When you click on Hello World, this Flutter module appears. Right? So this is a complete Flutter thing. You can actually run this in complete isolation without having to run this app. We shipped it to production. Nothing broke. So we were like, perfect. Add to app works for us. It doesn't crash, which means it works. So the next thing was, has anybody heard the saying like, the developer of a game is the best player till the date the game is released? Right? It's that thing. So we don't know how our customers are going to use the product, right? And we wanted to validate whether Flutter works in their hands or not. So we had to do more than a hello world. But what do we build? Now that was a very tricky question that we had to answer because, again, how long are you going to take to build a particular feature? Or how long do you need? So what we did was we shortlisted some features based on the effort impact ratio. We had a table where we had the effort like this, low, medium, high, and the impact, low, medium, high. We wanted to build something which was low effort but highest impact. Of course, it's not realistic. So we settled for something which was medium effort and medium impact to find out whether or not it works. So, like I said, that's what we picked. And without further ado, I can tell you that we shipped it as well. And it worked. What it was a new feature that allowed our power owners, so those owners who have multiple cars listed on our platform. And before this, because when the startup started, it was a peer-to-peer car sharing. So we were like, we have one car, we'll share that one car. Nobody thought there might be somebody who's like 100 cars and all on one platform being rented out, right? So for a lot of power owners, the previous feature actually, I don't know why I'm getting cramps in my leg, but okay. So for a lot of owners, they were not able to access the details about how their active trips or the upcoming or the historical trips look like. So you're like, let's build that for them. So they're happy, at least some set of users are happy if a feature is revealed. This whole thing is written in Flutter. Looks pretty amazing. We don't have any such thing in the native itself. So this was probably the best UI in the whole app, I'd say. Then we also had loaders. So notice the very platform-specific iOS loader that we were able to show, and the Android one on Android without doing anything. And then we were also able to display a very iOS-specific dialog and an Android-specific dialog when you clicked on that info button. So it all worked pretty nicely. And then, because designers were not happy with the first design, we said, we can do very quick iterations. So they were like, let's change the design. And we implemented this thing before we shipped it, right? So that was really nice. However, it was very painful to do this thing because the design said, this part can scroll, but this part needs to stick. Also, this part needs to scroll like this. And yeah, Flutter or not, it's hard to do, right? And even the experts here would be like, oh, can we really do it in Flutter? So somehow a couple of developers got together, scratched their head, looked a lot into the platform, managed to get this thing working. So we are done with the architecture. We had it sorted, the development strategy sorted, advocacy was the next thing. We're excited about it, but how do we excite others? How do we advocate for Flutter within the company? So we're a distributed team across Amsterdam and San Francisco. We now also have a team in Paris. And since the de-risking effort and all the evaluation was happening in Amsterdam, the SF team didn't know a lot about it. So if anybody was excited there, they were probably looking into Flutter on their own time and not because we were doing it. So how do we get them up to speed or actually acquainted to the platform? On-site trainings in SF. So 3 engineers from Amsterdam flew to San Francisco for a week to conduct hands-on code labs, workshops, training, talks, whatever, and followed by a 2-day hackathon so that whatever they learned in the first 3 days, they get a chance to get their hands dirty and again, fall in love with Flutter. But the response at the end, can anybody guess?
You said bad, but...
No, it was neutral. It was meh. So we did an NPS score kind of evaluation, which is like a net promoter score, right? So I think 6 and below, it's like negative, 7 and 8 are neutral, and 9 and 10 are positive. So we were somewhere between 7 and 8, which means, yeah, people don't really know or aren't excited about Flutter, but aren't even averse to the idea of using Flutter. It's understandable because for them, I think they only got very little exposure as opposed to what we had got. So it's not really fair to say that they had their chance or they could have done much better or loved it. We still weren't able to prove one crucial thing. Can anybody point that out yet?
Why people didn't want to use it?
Yeah, I mean, the why I think is...
Cost effectiveness?
No. Well, close to the answer that I'm looking for, but is it really fast? So we said that hot reload is really nice. You write code once, run everywhere. But is it really faster? And we weren't able to prove that with the first feature we built, right? So how do we figure that out? We tried to do another experiment to find out if Flutter was actually fast or not. So the hypothesis that we had looked something like, what we'll do is we want to adopt Flutter if and only if it's 2x or more faster than native development, right? This is the ground rule we've established. If that happens, clear cut, no more questions asked, we will go for Flutter. If it's anything below, until 1.5x, we will then have to look at other factors, cost effectiveness, or why is it between 1.5 and 2.x? Can we still lean towards the 2.0? And if it's below 1.5x, we're not doing it at all, right? So what we did was a bake-off. In the bake-off, what we did, we had 6 developers, 2 on an iOS team, native, 2 on an Android team, native, and 2 on a Flutter team, right? Now it was not some sort of a competition that, oh, you have to lose or I have to win, I'm gonna work extra hours or something like that. We were pretty strict about those kind of things. So I think it's the first time I've seen somebody tracking hours of work that they're doing at a product company, not being a contractor. So people were doing that. and we made sure that we removed all sorts of noises as much as we could do, because there might be other PMs poking you to fix some bugs or to do some other stuff. We were like, this is not going to happen during the bake-off. So 2 sprints, which was a month, is what you get to build the same feature in all the 3 platforms. And at the end, we'll decide how far along did we get and how fast was Flutter really. So team setting, like I told you, 2 iOS, 2 Android, and 2 Flutter developers. The experience on each team was a mix. Of course, Flutter would have a very low experience per se as compared to the native platform, but we did try to balance it as much as we could. Of course, we can't do a perfect experiment here. And we also had code reviewers on a separate team that would do code reviews for each of the teams, and also sync amongst themselves so that they are not doing strict code reviews on one and not on the other one. So we tried to have a balance between the code coverage, the quality, and the feature parity itself. The results: not all teams finished the features to the same level as expected because software development. Not all the teams had same test coverage, again, same reasons, and also the quality was not the same everywhere. But the Flutter team also met with some tooling issues. So if you all remember, there was a hotfix that was released just in July when they were to release a new version of Flutter, I think 1.4.8 or something. And that was a very crucial one that we needed to actually ship the app to the Play Store, because Google was actually not going to allow APKs if you didn't build both 32-bit, 64-bit, something like that. And that hotfix actually fixed that problem. After bringing that thing in, a lot of the other developer environments broke because they did not pull those changes, and we were not using the stable one. Because we were using add to app, we were constantly pulling the features that they were pushing to the Flutter development branch. So you had to always keep it in sync. And because that didn't happen, tooling broke for the Flutter guys. So this was I would say an unfortunate or an unfair advantage to the native team, but yeah, that's what you have to deal with in these kind of experiments. And Flutter was only 1.4x faster. Now this 1.4x is not an empirical number that we came up with a formula or something. It was a very vaguely calculated number based on what we agreed upon in the beginning. Like, we would give this much weightage to the tests, this much weightage to the number of PRs that you merge, or the level of feature that you're able to build within the 2 sprints, and then also how good your code is, how much can we reuse, things like that. And then also we factored out the amount of time people had to spend fighting the tooling or whatever, because it has to go in their advantage. Still, Flutter was only 1.4x fast. And like I mentioned in the beginning, unfortunately 1.5 was the cutoff before which we wouldn't even consider Flutter, right? And the good, the bad, we've all seen. So the good was the part where we actually found out everything works. The bad was the part where Flutter did not actually make the cut, about 1.5x. The ugly part is actually the issues that we faced during development. Like, the add-to-app instability while development was really bad. And it was so bad that it would actually overpower the love that people had gathered, that they would be frustrated by, like, okay, if this hot reload is not going to work, let me just always build the app, right? And if I can always build the app, why do I even need to use Flutter? Why can't I just go back to native development? So things like that were really frustrating. Dart VM failed to initialize. This happened a lot during development, and even at times when we were shipping APKs, probably because we were not usually adding the assets properly, or something that we were doing wrong. But the problem is, all the time we would just get this error that Dart VM failed to initialize. Okay, but why? And we didn't get an answer straight away in the logcat or whatever. And so we had to figure out in GitHub issues Dart VM not initialized, and there are like multiple people complaining about the same thing, but everybody has a different workaround to fix that thing. So that was one of the problems. Hot reload went out of sync at times when you're doing something, you made 4 or 5 changes, and suddenly it just goes out of sync, so you have to restart the whole app again and then enter the funnel to test your stuff. Builds were broken due to Catalina upgrade, so macOS Catalina. This actually did not happen on our machines. One developer in San Francisco decided to upgrade to Catalina suddenly, and then he's not able to build the projects anymore. Why? Because we use Flutter in the projects, and Flutter is not working with Catalina anymore. So that was a pretty painful thing, but I just wanted to bring it up because this is a possibility that can happen, right? If we don't monitor what OS people are running on our machines, or developers are running, they have the right to upgrade it as soon as that button appears in the top right corner. It keeps bothering you. And if somebody by mistake hit the button to install instead of restart later, yeah, they're screwed. Android Studio was not very happy with the iOS simulator. So it kept on killing the iOS simulator for some reason. So the iOS developers were like, okay, but we still want to write Flutter. So they started developing on Android emulators, and once they were happy with the feature, they were like, now I'm going to turn Xcode and then test it if it works on iOS. Of course it did because it has to, but this was a painful thing, and we did find a workaround for that. Then there was another stupid thing that happened was the text field with focus node attached to it cannot exist in a stateless widget if you want to remove focus from it. And by default, we were trying to be very 60 FPS-y, so we were not trying to create stateful widgets and stuff, so everything would go into a stateless widget. But when we encountered this problem, the solution or the workaround came out to be that wrap this thing inside a stateful widget so you can actually clear focus from that text field. Now, for a native developer, this is a very trivial task, right? How do you clear focus? Edit text, clear focus, or whatever thing, clear focus. So one of the iOS developers were like, dude, like to just clear focus, I have to do so many workarounds. Why are we even doing Flutter, right? These kind of things. Then Flutter fragment on Android should be presented in texture render mode. Now, how many people here who've ever dealt with fragments know that something like this exists? In 6 years of my Android development, I never encountered this thing. I didn't even know this existed. But the Flutter guys found out that if you have to show some views using a Flutter fragment on top of other native views, you cannot stack them unless you are in this render mode. You have to either go into the source code, clone that thing in, patch it yourself, and run the fragment in this mode, or you just end up using a native Flutter view. And then native developers were affected because Flutter had to be upgraded or installed. So like initially also, before we could merge the code into one single repository, we had to plan long in advance, and we had to announce, guys, this change is coming, winter is coming, or whatever. Please be ready, and on this day, you have to do all these steps. And a couple of people had to stay up till late because San Francisco is 9 hours behind. So when they come into the office tomorrow, and when they see a monorepo and they try to build the apps, nothing should break. And that's why this was a bit of a painful process, but people here were passionate about Flutter, so they were like, we'll do this as well. The decision, by now I think you've guessed what it was. We've decided to pull the plug on it. Not using it in an existing app anymore, mostly because of the reasons I told you. 1.4x was not the speed we were looking to achieve. However, next steps for us would be to remove Flutter and build the owner reservation feature in a native implementation of iOS and Android. Fortunately for us, because it's just like removing a module, it's not very painful. So we'll just replace the modules. However, the future is a bit nice. Flutter is a great technology, of course. When you're sitting in a Flutter meetup where people have come to listen about Flutter, you have to say this, right? Flutter is a great technology, right? No, but seriously, I'm not kidding. Flutter is a great technology, and we're definitely implementing stuff with Flutter, but only in greenfield projects. And we're looking for tooling to improve before we can actually migrate our existing app to Flutter. And one thing that I want to mention, and I think this should be the key takeaway. So if you've been sleeping all this while, it's perfectly fine. But now is the time to wake up for the next 3 slides, because if ever you decide to integrate Flutter into an existing app or any other cross-platform thing that's going to come in future, these are the 3 type of risks that you always have to look out for, and you'll get most of the answers whether or not you should go with that technology. The first one is the technical risks. These are mostly the development strategy and the architecture and stuff, if you're able to solve those problems with the framework you're trying to use or not. The second one is the organizational risks. So again, how do you advocate to people? How do you recruit people? How do we get Flutter senior developers or a distinguished engineer or a principal engineer? We can't find those people, right? And all the knowledge that other developers have gathered over the year, I won't say it will go down the drain, but you will still miss it. How do you retain employees? If people are like, we don't want to write Flutter, if you're going to do Flutter, we'll just leave. So these are all the organizational risks that you should also keep in mind. And the last one are the ecosystem risks. So some risks like, what if Google pulls the plug? What if they say tomorrow, we're not developing Flutter anymore? Or Flutter is only going to be used on Fuchsia, or I don't know how you pronounce that new OS name. But,
Fork it.
Sorry, what?
Fork it.
Fork it? Okay, whatever. So how do you manage that thing? And then again, how many people are actually contributing to Flutter or building new libraries that we need? These are all the ecosystem risks. If you try to break down things into these 3 portions, I think you can get a very solid understanding of whether this framework is for you or not. A special mention about the blog that I read in the very early days before we started doing this investigation. I think it was from Gabriel PL. He used to be an Android developer at Airbnb. And it was a 4 or 5 blog post series about why they sunset React Native at Android. And they had invested very heavily into React Native. So the things that they mentioned were like questions to me. So this was a problem with React Native at Airbnb. It comes back to me as a question. How do we handle this in Flutter at Getaround? The next question, this was a problem, this is a problem, this was a good thing. So a lot of answers we already figured from there. Things that we really couldn't figure out was like, okay, whether Google will pull the plug or not. Of course, if you go to a developer advocate in a conference, you're like, no, we're getting even more headcount and we're doing a lot more things with Flutter. So nobody's ever going to admit it, but you have to make a conscious decision about these things. So in the end, the relationship status of Flutter with Getaround is we don't talk anymore like we used to do. And any questions, you can probably catch me here before I run, or you can just tweet them out to me at DroidChef.